Hey, let me ask you a question. Do you remember how YouTube was back in the 2010s? That time when everyone played and watched Minecraft, Amnesia, Slenderman, and YouTubers like PewDiePie and Markiplier were starting to get the attention we know them for today? During this time, the creepypasta fever exploded. Horror tales that scared all the kids and made the parents have bad night's sleep. Because their children were in fear of a 3-meter tall, thin pale mannequin dressed in a tuxedo coming after them for stealing pages of his notebook. Created and popularized in this golden age of the internet terror were the infamous creatures from games like Slenderman Daily Pages, Sonic.exe, Luna Game, and many others that were making ground and saturating the channels of several YouTubers on the platform. The flow of amateur content done hastily to take advantage of people's engagement on YouTube was off the charts. But as a kid back then, I loved that shit and wanted more. Well, if I only had a way to use the ideas from the horror stories and creepypastas I've read, I could make my own games about them. But what platform would I use to make them? That's right, RPG Maker! It was one of the platforms that I saw being used the most to make games that I watched on YouTube. At the time, I also found out about the horror game genre and the software. Created by the ASCII company and currently developed by Enterbrain, RPG Maker was an engine created to make RPG-style games. Having had some experience with RPG Maker XP that I got from one of those magazines, with the installation CD and a complete guide on it, you know? I naturally felt drawn to these types of games because they had at least a little more production value than the rest of the material that I was exposed to. That were lazy, poorly made creepypasta games. The game's increased quality was due to the use of the basic assets the software provided. I remember watching gameplays of the most varied horror titles, original games, or based on creepypastas, most of which had their home in the RPG Maker software, which oddly enough, and in a way kind of ironic, was used for everything but to make a true RPG. Replace the turn-based battle system with exploration, puzzles, and narrative development. Going through different genres such as horror, comedy, walking simulator, dating sim, hentai, and many others. But what I remember being most used for was for horror games, with titles like The Witch's House, Mad Father, Yume Nikki, that maybe it's horror? I mean, there are a lot of horror elements and some weird stuff, and a lot of weird and disturbing events that happen to you depending on how you interpret it. But can it really be considered a horror game? Maybe it can just be interpreted as a walking simulator, like LSD Dream Emulator, or maybe as an avant-garde piece of art about a girl with social problems and... Anyway, exploration games without a clear purpose, like walking simulators, where you visit strange and possibly meaningless places. Those are my favorite, because they give me this idea of being inside a dream and unraveling a mystery where you are free to connect the dots and create a narrative that will likely only make sense to you. But I also appreciate the games where there is a well-constructed plot and involves the characters in a way that creates a narrative tied to the gameplay, where the key gameplay moments of the game are the ones that move the story forward. RPG Maker games, despite being limited and simple, considering the engine where they're created, make strong use of freedom in art direction and the use of simple mechanics in an ingenious way to create games that are genuinely interesting and even scary at times. You lie down to sleep in your warm and soft bed. The world outside, usually noisy and agitated, now quietly rests. Under the thin blanket of the dim light of the moon, the only thing that breaks the monotonous silence is the creaking and crackling of the furniture and the soft sound of your hair brushing against the pillow. Afraid of sleeping alone? In the dark? Completely vulnerable and far from any kind of safety? It Moves, released on August 2014 by a user known as No Owl, based on a creepypasta called Bedtime. You're in the shoes of a boy sleeping alone in his room for the first time after his brother got his own. But this new experience suddenly turns into a terrifying one, as he starts having strange and scary nightmares that force him to kill his parents to sleep with him every night. With each consecutive night, the nightmares get scarier, and with each night, the things in this nightmare seem to manifest in the real world. His parents try to make him get used to sleeping alone, which probably ends up creating a trauma for the poor boy, as a hole starts to appear on the wall where his bed is. A weird, ghoulish creature crawls out of it, and tries to drag him in, with fear taking over the player and the character at the same time, not knowing what will happen next. What could end up happening if the character is caught by the monster? Frozen by fear, and while all his muscles scream to get out, he can't scream or move to avoid the creature, in an experience similar to a sleep paralysis, culminating in a terrifying experience. It made me a bit scared of going to sleep with the bed close to the wall for a while, when I was younger. RPG Maker gave way to many scary games, some great and others not so much. One of those notable games was The Witch's House, which recently got an update. The Witch's House MV, updating its graphics and adding a new harder mode after finishing the main game. Released in 2012 by a user called Fami, and following the same steps as a game such as Amnesia and Mad Father, it got the attention of people for being a horror and action game where you control a girl who, while walking in the forest, finds herself lost and unable to get out. She then finds a black cat that accompanies her to an apparently abandoned house in the heart of the forest. Right after entering the creepy mansion, strange things begin to happen, and now she has to escape the traps this house has planned for her, while running away from the monsters that roam its narrow corridors and dark rooms. Using puzzles that require the player to pay attention to the rooms they've been to, and tropes that you usually see in many RPG Maker games, but use it in a creative way, with very good pixel art and even some cool scares that will catch you off guard. Standing out from most games of the era, but the game doesn't pull its punches, so be aware and pay attention, because this game will kill your character in many different and creative ways. Be ready to die, over and over again. Over the years, games that mix storytelling and engaging narrative with puzzle gameplay have become synonymous in this genre, with characters that had their own personality and story rather than being a container for the player, involving mechanics such as solving puzzles, running and hiding from monsters without being able to defend, work well when creating a narrative that uses the game mechanics itself to enhance the dramatic value of the story. Instead of having the story being spoon-fed to you through text, you actually see your actions affecting the story. But unfortunately, the trial and error and the frustrating moments of not knowing what to do next became the biggest thorns in my shoe, and it unfortunately made me give up on most of these games. I'll tell you, man, so many games do that. They put a puzzle out of the blue just to serve as a wall. You can't easily get through. You get stuck because you can't figure out how to solve it. I may be at fault of that, especially on those puzzles you gotta press the correct buttons, moving lights around until all the lights are on. I really hate those. Another thing that annoys me in games like that is the same problem you would find in point-and-click games, where you need an item to move on to the next area, but to get that item, you have to be pressing the action button through all the nooks and crannies of the place you're in, sometimes in random places you never thought of looking just to find the item. Like, would it be too hard just to tell me what I should be looking for? Or the general area where the item is? Or have the character mention when getting an object, "Ooh, this could be useful." It wouldn't be that hard, right? This unfortunately ends up weighing down on the experience of some games that didn't execute their ideas very well. Because after spending hours trying to figure out what to do and being chased by the game's monster for the 20th time, the fear aspect of it kinda goes away, and the game becomes a bit boring. Like what happens to Awani, a game released in 2004 and developed by a user called No Props, where you and a group of friends enter there, where they have to enter an abandoned house that started to become popular due to an urban legend where whoever enters it disappears. Being a skeptical protagonist who's not afraid of anything and only believes on the facts and not on the phantoms, you decided to enter with your group. Everything seems fine, until they hear strange sounds and separate to hide and investigate. After exploring the house and find some of your friends, you come across the titular monster, the Awani, that can be interpreted as Blue Demon in Japanese, despite looking a bit purple to me. Oh well, I guess he became purple due to the amount of red blood he consumes when devouring the protagonist's friends, one by one, even impersonating some at times, and make you question your sanity. The monster with the Under Dev's face painted purple will chase you through the entire game, with the worst kind of gameplay I've ever seen in a horror game, picking up a lot of the bad aspects of RPG Maker games, such as invisible event switches, soft locks that break your progression, items in places that don't make sense, ridiculous uses for items you collect, puzzles that don't have a clear way to solve them, and will often make you depend on a guide to even figure out how to solve it. It's just a big purple mess. Somehow, this game managed to be popular enough in Japan to have 2 sequels for mobile, 3 light novels, an anime adaptation, and 2 movies. 2 movies! Yeah, 2 of them. This just proves that RPG Maker games have an absurd potential, and all it takes is the right person to know about it and drive it into a multimedia work of art. Speaking of art, Ib is one that cannot be left out. Situated in a museum where its protagonist gets lost and separates from her family, wandering alone on the empty and creepy rooms of the museum, with its many art pieces looking at her and trying to get her attention. This experience of being alone in a place where, despite being quiet, still has a bit of life in it, is a recurring fear for many people. The feeling of despair, the loneliness, and the feeling of being helpless in a place that seemed to be normal but gradually reveals itself as something straight out of a nightmare is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. Entering this bizarre world, our protagonist, Ip, finds herself trying to find a way to escape from there along with 2 other characters who for some reason are also lost in this artistic world where every work of art wants to paint a canvas with your blood, having several puzzles that involving a little more than just putting the right object in the right place, and actually needing the player to think outside the box to solve them, with several endings somewhat difficult to achieve depending on how you interact with the characters during the game. Many that have been added as the game has been updated over the years. This game shows it has the potential to be a beautiful work of art, but not only for its horror games that RPG Maker is known for. It's just the top of the iceberg of what this platform and community has to offer. What is art? Art can be understood as the human activity of manifesting a concept or idea in an abstract and objective way in order to deliver a message or simply to make the spectator feel something or reflect on himself and the world around him. I wouldn't say the focus of all the games I'm going to mention is this, but they are definitely artistic, okay? What happens when you die in an RPG world? Space Funeral has a grotesque artistic direction and it's simply poorly done, but it has a purpose. The purpose to criticize the flood of RPG Maker games that look like copies of each other, with little to no creativity, using the stereo assets that the program makes available to create the most uninspiring games you've ever seen, that create a mediocre experience rather than a memorable one. Released on December 2010 by a user known as the Kadamites. In this game, you control a pink boy in yellow pajamas known as Philip, who travels through a grotesque world full of blood, violence, and death alongside his noble and faithful steed, Horse, on an adventure to save the world from a strange energy that is corrupting everyone and everything. In the same bizarre and artistic vibe is also worth mentioning Gingiva, where you control a music box whining key, a half-alien woman who allies herself with a set of dentures to face the evil CEO and its subordinates on the factory where you work just so you can have a free and normal life and no longer be a figurative cog in the capitalist machine. Hiddens, also created by the same developer, My Former Selves, with his surrealistic, chaotic art style, combining images with harsh colors and obnoxious patterns that hurts my eyes if I look at it for more than 2 minutes. And it's, well, very different from what we're used to, like with the case of Hellish. Created by Mason Lindroth, a stop-motion animator and game dev, this game has a lot of interesting sights to see. Using a very unique and unusual art style for what you expect from an RPG Maker game, this game has its graphics made with modeling clay and animated with a mixture of stop-motion and live action. That gives this game an innovative look that easily stands out from the others. Its gameplay is also great, with difficult but engaging battles that always encourage you to continue with the game's story. That, by the way, is crazy. You have to face a guy taking control of the world where you live, but to do that you have to band with a team of weirdos, and try and level up by consuming your own flesh, so that you become strong enough to face the big boss and finish him once and for all. Or not, since the game received a sequel in 2020, and it's even more loaded in the aesthetic department, with its unique visuals taken to the next level, and with an extremely chill soundtrack. But this time being a completely 3D game, and no longer made in the RPG Maker engine. So I don't know if I can mention it here, but it's certainly one of the best games in terms of art, aesthetics, and music I've ever seen. It's definitely worth playing. But while the game's graphic styles are bizarre and creepy, its stories are concise in its own words, and don't necessarily want to create an experience to make the player uncomfortable. With the exception of Gingiva, which fully intended to burn my eyes out. But not all of them are like that, right? Mugeko Castle, released in 2012 and developed by an user called Deep Sea Prisoner, sometimes known as Funamusia, which nowadays has shifted from the game making scene to become a VTuber. With its anime charm hiding the brutal reality of the inhabitants of this deplorable castle, this game is sure to rile your expectations of it being a happy and fun adventure. Their horrible attitudes towards the people who enter the castle and with themselves. This says a lot about the cruel nature of these high marketable little creatures. Seriously, I would love to have a plush of them. You play as a girl named Yonaka, a high school girl who's going home to see her brother, but her train has stopped at a strange station, and strange creatures obsessed with prosciutto, a type of meat, start chasing her, forcing her to enter the castle to escape them. But she finds herself in the mouth of the proverbial lion, because the castle is full of these creatures, and now with the help with some other strange creatures in the castle, she has to try and escape with her life. Another game that took me by surprise was Yume and the Pulsating Mass. Released in 2018 and developed by Casey Osme, this game makes you imagine it will be a quirky Earthbound-inspired RPG that, well, that's exactly it, but it gets more and more bizarre and frightening throughout the game, with several horrendous creatures and disturbing scenarios increasing more and more the tension and bizarreness of the world where the character lives, with each part of the game you go through. Okay, I just need to kill 10 more enemies, and I'll be at the right level to face the boss. I also need to stop by the shop and buy some items and equipment. I don't know how strong it will be. I hope I don't have to grind for another half hour just to progress through the story. It's true that I can't forget that I have to say that horror games with RPG elements also exist for this engine. Not most of them, but some do have this type of gameplay, like the incredible Off. Created by Martin Joris, better known as Marty's Ghost, in alias Conrad Colewood in 2008. Technically outside of the publishing window set for this video, but it can't be left out. Incarnating in the skin of this baseball player, you are sent into a strange world in order to cleanse it of ghosts and evil entities, accompanied by a cat, known as Judge, who guides you on your adventure, exploring, purifying, and saving the inhabitants of this weird and depressing place of its various dictators who command each of the zones, and now with a very well built setting this completely strange and alien world. Moving again from the time frame I'm using for the video, but one that still fits the theme, the long-awaited Omori was also released, starting development in 2013, but only released in 2020, made by Yomo Cat, who was known for making comics and selling clothes on her store. who decided to venture out creating an RPG about a hikikomori boy who has to overcome feelings of loneliness and abandonment after returning to his old home, which after traumatic events in his and his friends' lives, being home alone has never been the same. Having the player explore both the real world and the character's memories to try to fix this hole inside him and overcome his traumas. The narrative focuses more on discovering how Omori/Sunny will overcome his past traumas and how he will get back together with old friends in this world full of drama, nostalgia, and nightmares that will haunt him at every turn. The game is even full of disturbing, scary moments, but it mostly tries to be a chill RPG, technically split into two different games. Part of the game where you're playing Sunny's Dream World, where you play as the Omori character, exploring a fantasy world and going deep into your psyche like Psychonauts, in order to resolve your deep personal conflicts. And another part of the game where you play as Sunny, awake in the real world, having to live with the reality of what his life has become, and trying to glue back that perfect life he had as a kid. Trying to reconnect with friends who grew to hate each other, helping someone who may be suffering more than he is, or just simply trying to reconnect with those nostalgic moments he shared with his friends. How this culminating in a really dark and heavy ending, in terms of the themes implied, rather than from the scary imagery itself. It's certainly an experience that stays with you. After this great adventure we've been on, you can see how many games this program has provided us, and how many genres have been explored. There are many more besides the ones I mentioned. I only took the slice that captures the hard part of it that I like, but it's impossible not to consider these games as work of art in their respective genres, and it's undeniable to say that RPG Maker was one of the most influential game creation tools in the recent times, as much as Game Maker, Flash, or Unity. I don't know if you agree with my opinions or if you feel that the games I've presented here have already been covered to death, or that I should have highlighted more obscure games that left a mark on me, but I feel that these titles represent well what this community has to offer. A community that is still very much alive and active to this day. Consider that RPG Maker has been around since 1997, more than 20 years ago. It's refreshing and inspiring to know that you can open a program at any time and create your own game with your own weird little artsy ideas and share it with the world. That is why I really appreciate the presence these games made in my life, from my childhood until today. Thanks to everyone who watched it here. I hope you've enjoyed. If you think I left the game out or have something to share, as well as suggestions for future themes, leave it in the comments, I'd love to read it. Also, this was a pretty difficult video for me to make. Not only because I had all the work editing, researching and animating the scenes, but also because it was my first video of this kind of gaming essay thingy. And it was something I've been wanting to do for quite some time now. And I know it's very different for the content I make on this channel, but I hope you like this type of video. But that's about it. Thank you very much for watching this far. Until next time.